Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda. This is Kevin
Hi there.
with A. Smith Gallery. And today we have with us Eric Zeigler. Hi, Eric. And
Hello?
Aaron Ellison.
Welcome.
Yes.
Thank
The-
you.
these two guys won the Jurors Award for our Arts and Science um, exhibition that we had at the first of the year. It was juried by Linda Alterwitz. And the name of the image that they got the Jurors Award is Polypores Allerton Park and Retreat Center, Monticello, Illinois, Infrared Light 2024. And it is part of their body of work we're fixing to look at. And the name of their project is Instability.
Very good.
And Kevin, could you read the
I'll
bio?
read the bio. Eric Zeigler is Associate Professor of Art at the University of Toledo. His research and artistic practice interrogate the underpinnings of the history of the photographic process by purposefully exploiting problematic contemporary Western cultural categorizations and presumptions that are placed on photographic and lens-based imagery. Aaron Ellison is a Boston-based photographer, sculptor, writer, and senior research fellow emeritus in ecology at Harvard University. His research and artistic practice focus on the disintegration and reassembly of ecosystems following natural and anthropogenic disturbances. Working together, Eric and Aaron explore unknown worlds beyond our current understanding. Their joint work currently centers on non-anthropocentric, post-humanist aesthetics and creative photo documentation of forests in deep time. Wow, very cool. Well, welcome, guys. And if y'all want to somebody want to read your statement, go for it.
All right, I will do that. So it starts with a quote from Walter Benjamin. The state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. So our statement starts, watch for long enough, and anything that appears to be stable will reveal its true perpetual state of instability. Imaging devices record single moments, crack, trees fall, shutters snap, photographs are fixed. We expect these moments to be decisive, but when we combine the static objectivity of still images on film, paper, and glowing screens with our expectations of how the world works, we disregard its true dynamic nature. Using contemporary versions of 19th century dry collodion glass plates, 20th century film, and new digital technologies, we challenge the assumptions that photographs and digital images portray an objective reality. We reclaim the aesthetics behind the myths of the westward expansion, the American frontier, and similar colonialist activities that have occurred throughout the world and illuminate contradictions in 21st century narratives of environmental stability and preservation. Modern ecosystems deemed healthy and stable only because we've left them alone are shown to be far from stable, unchanging, and, as the U.S. National Park Service would have it, unimpaired. Are these tiny islands of nature within a vast ocean of unchecked development ecological reserves, or are they fading theme parks? The essence of their ongoing and essential decay, normally hidden behind an opaque yet gossamer fog, is unveiled in instability.
Wow, very, very nice. Very compelling. So, how did this come about? How did you guys get together to do this project?
Aaron, you want to take that one?
Sure. So back in 2020, we independently applied for an online residency through the Sci-Art Center, which was at the time a Boston-based art science collaborative project. It dissolved after COVID. And we independently applied. They invited applications from artists and scientists who were interested in collaborating and working together. And we were both selected. It was their fourth cohort of virtual residents, and it was a 6-month virtual residency in the fall of 2020. So by then we were already in COVID lockdown. The expectations were that we would meet every couple of weeks. We would write a blog and talk about how we found interacting with each other and what we learned from each other as artists and scientists. I've been an ecologist and done a lot of photography throughout my life. And Eric is a photographer, very interested in ecology, and we were matched. When we talked about it initially, my own experience with collaborative projects suggested that we should meet more than once every 2 weeks. So we decided to meet once a week, and we've been meeting once a week ever since fall 2020. So almost 5 years now, except when we're on travel or when we're in the field together taking photographs, which we've done on several excursions that have been really productive. And it's just been great. It's been a fabulous experience.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So y'all have become friends.
We
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. Well, so beyond the sort of ecology photography overlap, we both like woodworking, and it's just sort of it, it's strange how many things we had in common that we would get put together into this thing. So it's worked out pretty well for us.
Well, that's
Although I will say that Eric's fascination for really interesting cars is, I find I learn a lot. I learn a lot from that.
That's great. Well, y'all want to screen share? Eric, you want to screen share the images, and we'll ask a few questions. Okay, here you go. Eric, could you explain this statement in your bio and, if possible, give examples of images? His research and artistic practice interrogate the underpinnings of the history of the photographic process by purposefully exploiting problematic contemporary Western cultural categorizations and presumptions that are placed on photographic and lens-based imagery.
Yeah. So the first thing to know, I guess, in diving into this is that the history of photography is partially a technological history and it's partially a cultural history, right? In that those things are intertwined in strange ways as we go through time. But the first photographs, we presume at this moment that it's showing us the world, even though they're black and white, in the same way that if we took a black and white photograph today, it would be representative of all the colors that we see with our eyes. And that's not actually the case. These daguerreotypes and wet plate collodions and dry plate collodions, all these different types of processes up until we got to panchromatic film. So we had about 100 years of these, what are called alternative processes now. They weren't seeing all the colors in the world that we see. Typically, it was all the yellows and reds and oranges are missing in representation. And that ends up making the world look a little bit more bleak than it is and a little bit more kind of ripe for exploitation, as it turns out. And so we're fascinated, and I'm fascinated by these images that we take as sort of factual truth, as things that are giving us a false sense of security in terms of how the facts represent themselves. So one of the things that we're exploring is what are the implications of knowing that? So if you know that a photograph of the West in the 1860s doesn't show you how sort of alive or vibrant the vegetation is, and it also doesn't show you how many people are there because long exposure times, and also who's photographing and who they're excluding and so on. What did that mean for people at the time in the East who were seeing those photographs? How did it make them think about the Western world, or the Western part of the United States? And a lot of historians that are looking into this are consistently saying things like the photographs would help push along this narrative that the West is there for the taking, the frontier needs to be conquered, manifest destiny, etc. And so I'm interested in those implications of old photographs, but also what are the problems that we are making by believing the photographs that we make now? So are there other issues that are coming up because of how perfect the color is, or overly sharp our images are, and we sort of don't know what we're doing in the moment, and we don't know what we've done in the past necessarily either, because it's this wonderful mess that we have to untangle. So some examples of that, you can see here this diptych of images. This is a beech tree, and it's a snag, so it's a dead tree, and we've photographed it in a way that we've done this type of process multiple times. We take all the images that we make are made in multiple spectra. So the digital cameras that we have are converted to full spectrum, and we can put filters in front of the lens that changes whether or not we're seeing an infrared or ultraviolet or visible light, or other strange combinations as well. But with this particular pair, we're seeing invisible light, and we're also seeing a dry plate collodion. And this is obviously a contemporary one. We took these photographs a couple minutes apart from each other. There's two places in the world that are making dry plate collodions right now, and so we've purchased those, and I've got a 4x5 camera that we put these in. We've modified some things to make that work, but it shows you in a contemporary light how differently the world shows up with these 100, 150-year-old technologies. And we're interested in how does that kind of change our perception of the land. So in this pair of images, this is from Great Basin National Park in Nevada. We call this diptych promontory. And the helpful thing here is that this is a photograph actually in the Western United States. Of course, the previous one was in Michigan. And it's in winter, so we've got snowfall, and it makes the glass plate image very stark. But we see in the visible image, there's plenty of life going on. These are Great Basin bristlecone pines. They're several thousand years old, and it's this really harsh environment, but yet there's life happening. In the glass plate photograph, it's not necessarily apparent, but the rock formations are more apparent there. So the sort of shape of the land minus the vegetation is more the subject of that glass plate photograph. And in the contemporary full color one, we're looking at the plants more. So that again reveals this strangeness that we're perceiving things differently based on how that information is being given to us. And so the last one I want to talk about in this category is this photograph here called Charcoal Snags. And it's not part of a diptych, it's just this singular dry plate collodion. But we're looking out onto a vast landscape that has been burned several years prior. I believe this was the Black Fire from 2013 in this area. So at this time, that would have been 8 years old, roughly. And it is a vast sort of empty landscape, but things were growing back. The grasses are growing. There were obvious signs of small vegetation coming back, despite the fact that the trees were gone or burned and dead. But again, everything looks like it's sort of a wasteland here. And yeah, so that kind of covers that misperception that we have about the way that photographs work.
So as far as the import of this today, it's more about, so what I'm trying to say is, how does this relate to the ecology of these locations? It's about our perception, and then the way that we perceive this affects how we react to it. Is that kind of somewhat what you're saying?
So that's part of it. In my my career as an ecologist, as a professional ecologist, academic ecologist, which has extended over 45 years now. much of my work has focused on these kinds of changes in ecological systems, which include human systems, that have had some sort of what we think of as a disturbance, like fire going through. This is, of course, like almost all fires in the West, was set, right? It was an arson fire. It wasn't a lightning strike fire. And most
Right.
of the big fires are arson fires. So, but lightning strike fires happen too. And so we have disturbances from fire. We have disturbances from hurricanes, ice storms, putting in roads, whatever. And we find this, first off, we use a term like disturbance, which is a very loaded term, right? We don't like disturbance. We want things to be comfortable and undisturbed and peaceful, and yet disturbances are happening all the time to all sorts of things, which is another way of saying things are changing sort of all the time, and we're always dealing with that in subtle or very not so subtle ways. And that goes back to in the statement when we started out with quoting Walter Benjamin, and he was a philosopher in the early 20th century, and the passage comes from one of his theses on history that he wrote in 1940, when he says that the state of emergency is the normal state of affairs. That is, that we're constantly, as a human society, struggling with these very dynamic changes. And he was writing at the onset of the Second World War, writing these passages. But we don't, even as ecologists who study environmental change and ecological change and interactions between organisms, which are born, which are die, which move around, just like people are born, die, move around, emigrate. We're still not very comfortable with this. And a fairly well-known ecologist, a guy named Daniel Botkin, who wrote some of the first models of how forests change, computer models of how forests change, because forests are always changing, said ecologists, I'll paraphrase here, ecologists all study dynamics in ecological systems. We know these systems are changing all the time. But when an agency or an individual or a management organization asks us to give a prescription for how to manage that ecosystem, we write down a steady state solution, right? Which is a fancy way of saying, if you ask me how to manage an ecosystem and you say, I want to preserve or conserve the mountain butterfly, I will say, here's what you need to do to have 20 mountain butterflies every year. Even though you will never have 20 mountain butterflies every year. It'll fluctuate up and down. Some years will have really big years. Some years you'll have not so big years. And we know that, and we know that's the normal state of affairs. But we don't really want to admit that. And so in the next, the two images that I use to illustrate that, can you scroll to the next one, Eric? So this one, this one we call Divergence 2, because the railroad tracks are diverging in the woods. It's a digital image. It's not a dry plate collodion, but it's in reflected ultraviolet light, which is a narrower part of the spectral band from what the dry plate collodion picks up, which includes the ultraviolet, but also blues and a little bit into the yellows beyond that. The full color version of this is behind me over my right shoulder. So this image was taken in was photographed in a nature park in Berlin, in Germany. And it's a very interesting nature park. It was originally a railroad transit yard where all the trains would come in, from all over of Germany. There were like 20 or 30 tracks, and they'd be moved around to be sent off to different directions. And this rail yard was abandoned after the Berlin Wall was put up and during the Cold War, and it was completely forgotten. It was like in this no person's land between East Germany and West Germany. And after unification, someone walked into this rail yard, which now all the trees were growing up, and they called in a bunch of ecologists and they said, so what do you see here? And, is there anything interesting here? And it turns out that there are all sorts of interesting rare plants and animals that live in this particular environment, in addition to there being overgrown railroad tracks, which are particularly, I find, interesting to look at. But then the question becomes, okay, we have all these interesting butterflies and plants and other things in this park, and they all were growing in places. This is about 1992 now. They're all growing in places where there weren't any trees yet. There was just a lot of grass and some meadows that had taken over. Like, oh, good, we have endangered species here. How do we protect them? Because otherwise, if you don't maintain this as open land, you get trees growing up, right? Which is what we see in this photograph. So this is now 30 years, 35 years after the park was set aside. And in parts of the park, they have sheep now that are grazing to keep the land open. And in other places where there aren't sheep, the land has closed in. And this is an example of, well, we give you a prescription to maintain your butterflies, but nature is going to do exactly what it wants, which is constantly change and evolve. So that's what this one is. Next slide. The next one is one of our another different spectrum photograph. This one's in reflected infrared light, 850 nanometers and higher, and it's overtly it's a pond with trees around it and some cliffs. It's in Singapore. And up in the center right, there's a little black spot. And I didn't see the little black spot until I looked at it's a panorama, it's a stitched set of images until later on. And then I looked at it and said, oh man, there was dust on my lens. I gotta get that off. And then I looked closer and I said, wow, the reflection of that is in the water too. And I said, well, I ought to look at this in the visible image and the ultraviolet image and the full spectrum image, and none of which you could see the little black spot. And it has to do with the way the light is reflecting. And that's a nest of an eagle. And so this image is called Eagle's Nest. And so you see things in the infrared that you don't see otherwise. But more importantly, this isn't a sort of natural scene. This is a restored quarry. All right. So this lake is filled in of a quarry that was quarried for material to build modern day Singapore for 60 or 70 years before it was abandoned, and now is in the middle of one of the largest nature parks on the island of Singapore. And yet it gets thousands and thousands of visitors a year. And yet people walk in there, and unless you had the signboard and read it that said, you're standing in the middle of the quarry, you'd be walking around saying, wow, isn't this forest beautiful? And there's a lake here. And so we don't really get that sense of time and change or whatever, because we just don't see it. So my research as a scientist has focused on how these processes play out. And as a photographer and working with Eric, how we can illustrate these in a way that help people or provoke people to think a little bit more about this temporal dimension of change.
Wow. So getting back to something that Eric said earlier, it's going back to old cameras and old processes where it was black and white, as opposed to color, and so what you see is completely different. So how did that affect the viewers at that time that were say in New York or on the East Coast, and they were viewing images of the Old West? And could you elaborate a little bit on their what their perception was, and that how that possibly affected what happened to the West?
Mhm. Well, it's of course hard to know exactly, right? But we do know that um, things like stereo cards were, produced in mass and distributed and shared and also seen as, it was like something to do. You would get some new stereo cards and you would have people over and you'd look at them for long periods of time. And so that there was this, sort of time spent with images that we would probably afford to television or something similar now, right? Um, so the focus and concentration is one thing that's different for um, you know that that type of viewer from the photographic kind of viewing that we do today. And the predominance of black and white was also black and white's an abstraction unto itself. So we are aware in one sense that we're not seeing um, a physical reality. And, presumably many people looking at these images would also have maybe one portrait of their family or a couple portraits, depending on what time period it is and how cheap those things are to get, and who they are. Um, and so there is this sense of understanding that abstraction of, like my sibling looks like this in real life, but of course the photograph looks like this, and I'm going to make up something in my head that kind of puts those two things together, right? Um, but in that case, I have the advantage of seeing my sibling and knowing that there's that difference, and there were, of course, photographs of landscapes and so on in the East, but those were far less of a fascination than the images in the West. And so the images in the West, like the West is stark, and like I mentioned before, the rock formations kind of present themselves first instead of the vegetation.
Right.
And I think that the the predominant narratives that were already going on, like we need to um, sort of take this land over and civilize it, and all these kind of colonialist narratives, and hopes and dreams really are put into the images. And you see this gigantic rock in this photograph, and the title says Silver Mine. It seems obvious and imperative, if that's your only viewpoint of the space, that of course we would extract that silver, because I'm sitting here, I don't have enough money that I want, right? And if somebody can get me more silver, then everything's better. And if there's no plants and there's no people in this space, who cares?
Well,
So
so you think if the images would have been in color, it would have been a different outcome. Is that kind of what you're saying to a certain extent?
it's quite possible. I think that setting up a kind of this definitely would have happened scenario was quite difficult. But I think what we're interested in exploring is that sort of like what if, and hoping that the viewer will make those connections and think about, well, what choices am I making now? Because I think, this part of the world looks like this, and I ought to have something from there as a result of this image that I've seen. And, making people think about what are the parts of the story that I'm not seeing, because they're the limitations of whatever medium it is are really important.
So
Right.
if I can add a couple things here. One is, as Eric points out, it's a what if problem, and we don't have a lot of data, and it hasn't actually been interrogated that much in exhibitions or in photographic history. But there was an exhibition 35 years ago at Boston University called Mapping the West, 19th century American landscape photographs from the Boston Public Library, which turns out to hold an awful lot of Timothy S. Sullivan and Carlton Watkins photographs, and negatives, which is remarkable. And you can just go into the archives and look at them, which is really, really wonderful. And it covers some of this ground, in terms of manifest destiny. One of my favorite captions of a photograph There's one by Alexander Gardner, picture of the railroad, building the railroad, called Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, laying track 300 miles west of the Missouri River, 1867. And they discuss a lot of in the catalog to this, they discuss a lot of the this manifest destiny approach. At the same time that this was happening, and this refers to the color part, painters from the Hudson River School were going out west and painting these giant landscapes. And many of these landscape paintings were then displayed in Congress in Washington, in the halls of Congress, to help guide and lead to the establishment of the national parks in the United States. And so here were the color images. And again, referring back to the artist statement, the National Park Act, the legislation that established the national parks, the so-called Organic Act of, I think, 1906, basically requires the Park Service to conserve these landscapes unimpaired for future generations. So already we're back to it's got to stay the same, so that, and this is actually written in the legislation, so that someone who looks at it in 50 years will see the exact same thing that was when this park was established. Now, of course, that's impossible. You look at Ansel Adams photographs, other photographs from these parks were established. Their huts, their railroads, and of course, the railroads really lobbied for the national parks because they could bring trains to the national parks and build all these big lodges. If you go to the parks, those were all built by the railroad companies to bring people to make money for the railroads. So, but the color paintings were used to mobilize the legislation. And we know this from the congressional record, but the black and white photographs, we think, helped sort of lay the template for this is something that we can do. We can exploit this.
Wow. Wow.
I can drop you an article I wrote about that, on the color side of it. I wrote it down.
Absolutely. That'd be great. I think I actually already addressed that second question, or you did. It says, Aaron, could you explain this statement in your bio, and if possible, give examples of images? Quote, his research and artistic practice focus on the disintegration and reassembly of ecosystems following natural and anthropogenic disturbances.
Yeah, I think we've covered that.
Yeah, okay. Here's the next question. Could you explain and expand on your statement? Are these tiny islands of nature within a vast ocean of unchecked development, ecological reserves, or fading theme parks?
So we've talked a little bit about that already too, but I can give some photo examples to it. So this photograph is from Namibia, and it's a baobab tree, and it's inside of a national park there, but you can't necessarily tell that from the context of the photograph, right? And one of the things that we think about is this that hope rather of creating a park and keeping it unimpaired for the future. What does that do for people's perceptions of what a natural space is? So, if you take yourself to a national park and you wander around in Yellowstone or Yosemite or something like that, and you look around and you expect that, yeah, this is exactly what it looked like years ago. You also expect that this is sort of the normal course of what trees and plants and animals and other things interacting with each other looks like. But of course, that's not the case, right? There's traffic, there's roads, there's all kinds of people doing what we call upkeep, right? Like clearing underbrush, etc., making sure that the place doesn't catch on fire or ignoring the fact that it will catch on fire if we don't do anything. All these various sort of practices that change the landscape, but typically in invisible ways because something happened 5 years ago, the scar or the disturbance is invisible now because things have grown back up. And how do we know that from a photograph? It's very difficult to tell. So we've tried to make images in places and look at things that we can tell a story about and say, this is sort of an unnatural existence for this thing, even though it exists in nature, but it's very encumbered by the choices and decisions that we've made as a industrialist society.
Interesting. Well, here's the last question. Quote, watch for long enough and anything that appears to be stable will reveal its true perpetual state of instability. But imaging devices record single glances of the world. Further, when we overlay the fixed objectivity of still images on film, paper, and glowing screens onto our expectations of how the world works, we are subconsciously disregarding change and misrepresenting the instability of the reality we live in. Why does what you have said here matter?
Right now, it's end of June 2025, and something like a third of the countries in the world are currently involved in some kind of conflict or war and are living through incredible rates of change, not to even talk about whether it's climate change or urban redevelopment or any of the other sorts of changes that go on in our lives all the time. And yet, if we think from photographs or from whatever paintings, whatever are our sort of guiding stars in this, that the world is stable and unchanging, there's this constant cognitive dissonance that makes it very difficult to figure out how you deal with constant and ongoing change. You can retreat into your couch. You can't avoid it watching television, right? Unless you're just watching the TV shows, particularly some of the Scandinavian ones where you just watch a fireplace for days and days and days, which is wonderful, although it's combustion. It's changing, as in this photograph from Hardwick Pines State Park in Michigan, which has some of the last old growth white pine forests in Michigan, magnificent, towering white pines right next to, within the same park. You can walk on this trail and you can see what is left from when Michigan was completely deforested in the late 1800s. And so these white pine stumps in this field from which now new trees are growing, these were cut and these fields were burned in an attempt to grow vegetable row crops on sandy outwash plains in the northern part of the Mitten in Michigan. Totally unsuited for growing anything other than potatoes and ferns and trees. But you look at this and say, well, this is the reality. Well, what is the reality here? How do we make our day-to-day behavior agree with or work with or embrace or push back against a reality of constant change. And I mean, I think we would argue that we're actually not very good at that. We're good at it in small ways, right? I live in downtown Boston. There's construction going on around me all the time. The entire city feels like it's being redeveloped every 5 years or 10 years. Is that normal, or would I prefer to be in a leafy suburban neighborhood that is always leafy and suburban, but got carved out of something like this farm field or this abandoned pine cutover? And so, our behavior, our day-to-day behavior and how we live and how we manage living in the world derives a lot from how we perceive the world. And if one of the things I think we're trying to do with our photography is trying to push people a little bit out of the idea that what we see as an image not only is, we could call it a snapshot, we could call it something objective, but that it's really not fixed. It's a fleeting instant in time. It'll never happen again. It only happened once. It'll never happen again. If you went right back to this place tomorrow, it would be completely different. And the slowing down, I particularly like working with the glass plates, and because it really forces you to slow down and pay attention. You're not just knocking off 1,000 digital images because you can, and then waiting till the evening to see which one actually worked. We carry 10 plates with us at a time, maybe. And every one of them, it's like, is this one really worth the time? And what's it going to look like in 3 weeks when we really get back to processing it? So it forces us to, in a good way, to slow down, look at things, and think about what's changing, and how do we capture that change in film.
So would accepting constant change be good for the environment? I think
So
what I'm asking is if
yeah.
the population accepts constant change, then it would be easier to accept, destruction too, or no? I mean,
Well, I think it's an interesting challenge. I'll give a quick vignette here. I got into this as sort of a way of thinking about blending the science that I do with the creativity that I do. When I gave a talk at Boston University back in 2009. And I had been approached by a graduate student there in 2008. And they wrote and they emailed me, said, we'd like you to come talk to the graduate students in the art department at Boston University. And I'm like, why are you reaching out to a scientist to give a talk to a fine arts department? And so I wrote back a question. I said, why are you doing this? And they said, well, we did this because as a group of graduate students, we're always interested in bringing in people who think about things that we're also interested in. And our group is interested in disturbance. And we were hunting around the web and we saw you're an ecologist who studies disturbance. So we thought it'd be great if you would come and talk to us about what you do. And I said, sure, I can do that. And my calendar is full, but we can schedule it at that time for about a year from then when they contacted me. So we put it on the calendar. And then I spent an entire year fretting about giving this talk, right? Thinking, what am I going to say about disturbance to a bunch of fine artists who think about disturbance very differently from how I think about disturbance. And so I put together this talk about exactly the question you just asked, which is, if we think about constant environmental change, what does this mean for how we ought to behave? And what would this mean for, do we try to stop it? Do we try to acclimate to it? Do we try to adjust it? Do we try to figure out how to modify our behavior? Maybe if we don't want so much environmental change, maybe we'll change our behavior to try and slow it down. You're never going to stop it. Or you could say, we're going to really embrace this and we're going to do all these things because change is really exciting and artists are always pushing the envelope and this is what we want to do. And as a further aside, that talk became the paper that I just sent you the PDF of. So that's essentially the longer elaborative text that took 5 more years to write and get published. And is the basis of a book I've been working on for the last 10 years. That's a whole nother story. I gave this talk, it was an hour talk, about 25 graduate students. And at the end of it, a number of them were so distressed and so distraught by this. First off, it had never occurred to them that the environment was constantly changing, right? That this happened naturally and this happened because we did things. They had real trouble wrapping their heads around this idea that there was all this change going on. And here I was talking to artists who were constantly pushing the boundaries. And that set my whole framing for how I integrate my art and science. And I retired 4.5 years ago now from Harvard and really have been able to pursue this in much greater detail, working with Eric collaboratively. And it's constantly rewarding, but that addressing that question you asked, that is the central conundrum. What do you do about that? Lord Alfred North Whitehead wrote 100 years ago that, the great ages of civilization are the unstable ages. And, that's really profound. It's like out of all this chaos comes big advances in civilization. Do we want that all the time? Do we want that just once in a 200 years? How do we catalyze that, slow it down, think about that? Anything other than walk into it blindly and not think about it at all. Simply asking the question that you asked is really the first step towards figuring out what that means and what you want to do about it. We almost never ask that question. It's too painful. It's too painful. Otherwise, right. You look at the language in the newspapers. It's the climate emergency, the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis. All of these are it's loaded language, right? No matter where we come down on the debate about climate change, the language puts us in a position of opposition. And that doesn't help us figure out how to behave.
And it implies possible participation. Right.
Yeah, you have to participate. You
Yeah.
actually have to participate as opposed to, you can also just choose to sit on the sidelines. That's fine too, but acknowledge by asking the question that you've made that choice to sit on the sidelines, because that's also a choice.
Right.
It's like managing an ecosystem. If you really want to manage for change, maybe what you want to do is take a big piece of land and set it aside like a national park, but then leave it alone. Don't actually worry about it being the same in 100 years. It'll be different in 100 years. How interesting would that be?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a whole nother approach, right? But we like to manage things. We like to do things. We like to cut trees, whatever. So.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. We would like to run through your other images.
Sure.
Let's screen share those. Can y'all see that?
Yep.
We can.
This is a beautiful image. I mean, apart from any content, it's a really nice image.
Thank you.
Thanks. So this is at it's
Kellogg Biological
yeah,
Station.
Kellogg Biological Station. They have a experimental forest, and this was a utility right of way that goes right through it. So there'd been, this swath of trees that were cut down, and there's, of course, you can see the logs in the foreground. It's a red pine tree that's been cut, and they match visually these steel pylons that need to be assembled for the electrical lines that are coming through. But and so this image is in the ultraviolet, um, and that's extra important for what's going on here. That when I took this photograph, it was I don't remember what the air quality number was, but it was awful.
Terrible.
It was very, very bad.
Yeah.
So the wildfire smoke from the Canadian wildfires at the time had come down, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And this was um I went home after this image because it just wasn't worth being outside any longer. And
And I was there for the week giving a series of lectures at the station to the ecologists.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, the ultraviolet light or the reflected ultraviolet shows the density and the thickness of the air much more readily than a visible light, or the infrared doesn't show up at all. The infrared just sort of sees right through that. So the feeling of that heaviness of breathing the smoke in, became apparent in this photograph.
Very nice. This also is a beautiful image.
Thanks.
So the week before we were at Kellogg, we had a residency, an artist residency at the Huron Mountain Wildlife Foundation up on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it's in one of the largest sections of old growth forest in Michigan. It's yet, and this was an example of where you have old growth forest, but it's constantly changing. There's a fire that went through here 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and all that's left of that is the stump in the middle. And it's really accentuated in the infrared here.
Wow.
And we have several panoramas throughout. Those are also kind of same way as the dry plate collodions. They're a callback to that 19th century understanding of the world. Panoramas started as a way of expanding the way that stories were told about, places that weren't wherever the audience was, and there'd be these paintings that were rolled up, and the painting would sort of scroll by, and things would be narrated and acted out. And the panoramic photographic style was a product of that. So we've kind of subtly integrated that into our works as well.
It also gave the illusion of everything being large and unlimited.
Mm-hmm. So this photograph is it's not a very specific spectra. It's a very strange kind of conglomeration of things. So we call it digital aerochrome. It's a digital re-representation of a film that Kodak made. I think it started in the 50s as a way to do aerial reconnaissance. So it doesn't say you have a hideout, and the forest around you is green, and you've got sort of a green tarp over top of you, right? If you were to use this film from an airplane over top, instead of seeing a vast sea of green, you would see a dark spot where your tarp is, and the rest of it would be pink. So it was a way of detecting the enemy, right? So something born out of a military sort of assignment was then used by scientists to figure out, well, how healthy are these forests, et cetera. So you could use that same aerial reconnaissance imagery to figure out how well things are going. This is a digital version of that. So our full spectrum cameras, we can just put a filter on the front and we can do something that looks the same. It's not actually doing the same specific thing that the film was doing, but um, it's gathering light from the infrared and it's shoving it down into the visible spectrum. And so that's why everything is sort of glowing in this candy colored pink light. But this image is from Jeju Island in Korea, and it's up on Mount Ellison, which is a volcano, and it's a tree that's fallen in multiple different directions, and the kind of order of those operations is not quite clear, which adds to the sort of fun mystery of this strange pink image.
That's gorgeous. Yeah, these are all really nice.
Thank you.
And this is that last one and this one both are, I think that this one actually no, that this one is
This one,
ultraviolet, right?
yeah, yeah.
The last one is the it's a digital collodion. So we use a filter sandwich on the camera that gives the same spectral response that a dry plate collodion would. So this gives us both the ultraviolet and the up to about 500 nanometers, 525 nanometers into the visible. So you get a little bit more depth and contrast in the image than we do in the ultraviolet one in the next one, for example.
Nice.
And you can do really incredible things with different kinds of filters that, we never really appreciated, I think, when we were strictly working with film, that there's a bunch more expansion possibilities with the digital cameras that we can
Yeah, I mean, these are all really, really nice images.
Thanks.
Is that infrared on the left there?
Correct, yes. You can
Yeah,
see
we
here that
use these diptychs or triptychs or whatever to really prod the viewers to ask the question, what am I really seeing here? Right? What is real in this? They're exact same pictures. They're taken, you just swap the filter on the camera. And you have a completely different perception of what's going on in the forest.
you can see here that I was just talking earlier about how infrared sort of sees through haze and so on. You know, it's a cloud forest, so that like there's literally clouds and fog around us, but in the infrared, the contrast is quite high. It looks like the sun is out, and
Right, right. Is this the same process from earlier?
Yes, this is the digital aerochrome again. Although it got there slightly differently. So when we took this image, we were using a filter that is called a hypercolor filter. So it goes from transmits from 470 nanometers all the way up to the infrared, and then we color swapped it afterwards to give it the aerochrome look. Subsequent to that, these digital aerochrome specific filters were developed. So now you can get this look and feel a little differently. But it's another example of you can get at the similar looks with very different approaches, either different technical approaches or different filters.
Right.
this is another infrared photograph, and um, the one of the wondrous things happening here is the fact that the inside of this stump is fully charred, very dark. And the infrared imagery retains that while turning all of the vegetation just pure white. So we get this hugely stark contrast there, which is really wonderful.
It is, absolutely.
This one's
Go back. There we go.
yeah. So this is also from Jeju Island, and in Korea, and it's the top half of the image is a tree growing out of the rock, and the bottom half of the image is lava rock. And where one starts and ends is hard to determine here, which is another sort of wonderful thing that happened.
Yeah, yeah. That's the original image we were looking at.
Mhm.
This is another digital collodion, and this is one of these things that we were in Busan in Korea. We were in Korea last summer to give a talk and put up an exhibition there. And when we're walking in this forest, we saw this pair of trees, and trees that are the same species will often graft into one another. But these are two completely different trees, and they're not grafted into one another. There's a very clear line of separation, and yet they're hugging each other. And as a confirmed tree hugger, I just thought it was
Well, it's
it
a
was a
very
great.
sensual image. I love it.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I think
Yeah.
it's a great image. But again, this is one in most of these, we take the images in all the different spectra: visible, ultraviolet, digital, or glass plate, collodion, infrared, full spectrum. And usually only one of them really works as something that is, as we say, not just another picture of a tree.
Yeah.
This one is, I think, really fascinating because when we compare this with the visible one or the full spectrum one, you can see the reflections of the trees in the pond very clearly, which they almost disappear here because of the different transmission of UV light into water. So you don't the reflections get lost. And in contrast, the carnivorous plants that are growing on the logs, which look like these bright skeletons, just become much more apparent, especially if you know what you're looking for with the carnivorous plants. But the interest, this is a very interesting one because you're sitting there looking at water, and yet there's almost no reflection of the
Right.
trees there.
Also in Korea, this is in Seoraksan National Park. This is a full spectrum photograph, so we don't have many of these in the larger group, but it's the converted digital camera without a filter in front of it. So the sensor is seeing everything from the ultraviolet all the way up through the infrared. So you're seeing ultraviolet, visible, and infrared light all kind of smashing together, which creates these often very strange colorations. Sometimes it just makes the images completely brown, but here, we have this sort of flat wall that appears more flat and less flat because of the color strangeness going on. Um, and we haven't used the full spectrum images very much because they often become that brown color and it, information sort of gets lost. But here, more information from this space was available.
Wow. Beautiful.
So this is actually, it's it's the other direction from that previous image, and maybe a couple hundred feet down the trail. Um, Panorama, and you can see about 2/3 of the way into the image from the left side. There's a waterfall, and that section of waterfall that's visible is about 900 feet high. So that gives you a sense of the extreme scale that's going on here. Um, but we felt that this image, it sort of looks like, Chinese landscape paintings, and
Mhm.
there's a few things coming together to make that happen, right? You've got this elevated position, or point of view. We have the infrared light, which is giving us this high contrast, and also the panorama, or this sort of like panoramic, no foreground vision of the world lent itself to that. So it was this, we've been working with, um, West American West imagery, and having a photograph that sort of worked with the traditional painting from this area was really sort of a wonderful surprise to be able to make.
It almost looks like if you remove the trees from the foreground, which give you a sense of scale, it looks like something in miniature in the back,
Hmm.
which gives it more of that painting look.
Right. Yeah.
Very cool. That's infrared, correct?
Mm.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And the reason that you get the glowing white in vegetation and infrared is something called the Wood effect, which has nothing to do with wood. The guy who discovered it was named Wood in the 1920s. And it's because infrared light bounces around and reflects very dramatically inside the chloroplasts of the plant, and that's what gives you that glowing thing. So they're not thermal infrared cameras in the sense they're not picking up heat. They're
Right.
picking up this bouncing around of the infrared radiation in the cells.
And it looks like snow because it's the same physical process happening when light hits snow and bounces around in the visible spectrum. So
Uh,
it shows up to us in the same way. So this last one, so this is a rare instance where the spectrum of the photograph probably doesn't matter all that much. This one's shot in the ultraviolet, but we printed out the visible and well, desaturated visible, and the infrared and so on, and they all looked quite similar. And so we just ended up choosing the one that happened to have more contrast, and that was the ultraviolet one. But this is the inside of yet another tree at that Allerton Park and Retreat Center in Illinois that had, a flume of fire on the inside and just this very thin shell. We're just peeking through that little slash into the outside space of the forest, which is, appears undisturbed out there.
right, right. Well, guys, this has been incredibly fascinating. Really, really wonderful.
Well, we'll make a quick pitch, which is if you want to see more, we've got a photo book on this now.
Okay,
And I will put the web link in the chat for you.
that would be great.
And
If you have one, you can hold it up.
I don't have one with me here, actually.
I've got one behind me. I'll grab one in a second. But
The book is called Instability as well, and is published by Snap Collective, and it's a print on demand, so anybody can order it. In a few weeks, you'll receive it.
Okay,
Okay, great. Wonderful.
I'll put that in the blog.
I'll
Very
grab
good.
a copy right behind me. Well, it's still shrink wrapped.
There we go. Fantastic.
Cool.
So everybody go out and get one.
Please.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, this has been really wonderful because it's, it was coming at us from two directions. It's got the academic aspect, and then the photographs themselves are just gorgeous. I mean, they're really well done. So congratulations, guys. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great time talking with you this afternoon.
Yeah, it's been great.
Wonderful talking to you. And we want to thank Linda too for hooking us up with y'all.
Yes.
Great.
Well, thanks a whole bunch and good luck with everything in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.